He boarded a night train to escape the noise, the headlines, the voices in his head. But what he found was a coffin on wheels. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, David Rourke vanished into a sleeper car no one remembers and came face to face with a corpse that wouldn't stay dead. Why did the conductor lock him in? What was stitched beneath the body skin? And most terrifying of all, why did it smile when no one was looking? What happens when your last ride is one way into the unknown? The platform was eerily quiet for a Thursday evening, especially at a station that, by all appearances, should have been shut down a decade ago. The cracked tiles under David Rourke's boots echoed more than they should have. The sound of each footstep bouncing off the stained, graffiti-scarred walls as though the station itself were mimicking him. The signs were faded, half in Cyrillic, half in a forgotten dialect that looked like it hadn't seen a spell checker since the Cold War. He clutched his one-way ticket to Târgu Frumos, a town he picked not for its sights or history, but for its complete absence from travel blogs. That was the point. Anonymity, obscurity, silence. The train's headlights split the night like a scalpel through black velvet, its mechanical groan more of a growl than a whistle as it pulled into the station, dragging behind it a series of weather-beaten cars that looked like they'd been repurposed from a Soviet museum. David waited for other passengers to approach, but no one came. He was alone on the platform, and it was starting to feel intentional. A tall conductor emerged from the shadows, not walking so much as gliding with long, mechanical strides, as if time between each step didn't quite add up. He didn't ask for David's ticket. He simply nodded, reached out a gloved hand, and gestured toward one of the sleeper cars. "Compartment 9, he said in a low voice that had the texture of sandpaper dragged across stone. David stepped up into the train, the air inside instantly heavier, almost damp, like it had been sealed shut for months. The lights flickered overhead with a sickly green tint, and despite the dozens of compartments on either side of the narrow corridor, the entire car felt abandoned. Paint peeled in long strips along the walls. Windows were smeared with grime from the inside. Yet everything felt staged, deliberately aged, like a movie set built to simulate decay. As David made his way to compartment 9, the floor creaked beneath him with a sound too hollow to be wood and too rhythmic to be accidental. When he reached his assigned room, the door was already ajar, as though someone, or something, had been expecting him. Inside was a single bed bolted to the wall, thin sheets folded with military precision, a dusty mirror cracked along the top corner, and nothing else. No outlets, no light switch, just a metal latch on the inside of the door and a pale blue glass bulb above the window, faintly humming. David turned to ask the conductor something, anything, but the man was gone. Not down the corridor, not outside, gone as if he had stepped out of existence rather than out of frame. He considered leaving, getting off before the train moved, but something made him stay. The weight of exhaustion, maybe, or the weight of something deeper. An invisible hand that pressed gently against his chest, not enough to alarm, just enough to suggest surrender. With a sigh, he placed his bag at the foot of the bed and sat down, feeling the springs scream beneath him like something had been buried in the mattress and didn't appreciate being disturbed. The train hissed, shuddered, then lurched forward like it needed convincing. Outside, the darkness swallowed the station whole, and with it, every trace of connection to the world David had known. The door swung shut on its own. The metal latch clicked into place, not loudly, but with the quiet finality of a vault ceiling. David stood, heart thudding, and tested the handle. It didn't budge, not even a little. He knocked, then pounded. Nothing. He shouted down the hallway, but his voice was devoured by the train's endless groaning. A faint smell of mildew and something medicinal filled his nostrils. Formaldehyde? It coated the air like invisible moss, growing thicker with each breath. He backed away from the door and turned to the mirror. His reflection flickered, not distorted, but delayed. His mouth moved a second before the mirror caught up. He blinked and caught his mirrored self still staring, unblinking a fraction too long. A scraping sound came from the ventilation shaft above the bed. Not wind, not metal, nails. Fingernails dragging across the inside. David froze, eyes locked on the vent, when suddenly the overhead light dimmed to a sickly pulse, then stabilized. In that flicker, he saw something impossible. A silhouette, briefly reflected in the mirror behind him, broad-shouldered, still watching. But when he turned around, the room was empty. He stepped toward the door again, trying not to panic, just as a slow knock sounded from the other side. 3 knocks. Heavy. Deliberate. He hesitated, then opened the latch. The conductor stood there, impassive. But this time, his gloved hands were not empty. He held a clipboard in one, a small burlap sack in the other. Wordlessly, he stepped forward and placed the sack on David's bed. Then he turned around and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. David reached for the sack with shaking hands. Inside were folded clothes. They weren't his. A wool coat, heavy boots, a knitted scarf with faded initials embroidered in red thread. R. Beneath the clothes, a tarnished silver pendant lay nestled in the fabric, engraved with a date, October 12, 1974. Nothing else. No explanation. No note. Just a feeling in his gut that something had begun. And there would be no stopping it now. David Rourke had not always been a man seeking shadows. Once, he had been the kind of journalist who ran toward the fire, not away from it. His name had graced the bylines of prestigious investigative exposés. His voice had echoed through late-night news segments, and his face had been plastered across magazines under bold headlines like The Truth Taker. But success in his field had a cost, and it came in the form of a story he never should have published. A year before the train, David had uncovered a military cover-up involving secret detention facilities operating on U.S. soil, black sites for domestic dissidents, whistleblowers, and, allegedly, even journalists. He had the evidence, the testimonies, and the moral high ground. He thought that would be enough. It wasn't. The article sparked a brief media frenzy, a congressional hearing that went nowhere, and a quiet war on David himself. Friends stopped calling. Editors grew cold. His apartment was broken into 3 times, each time nothing stolen, just rearranged, violated. His cat disappeared. Then his laptop. Then his piece. He began to feel watched, even in the most ordinary of places. A diner window reflecting more eyes than should be there. A stranger on the bus repeating the same page of a book for hours. A voice on the phone that hung up if he spoke first. One night, he awoke to find all the light bulbs in his apartment removed and stacked neatly on the kitchen counter beside a single typed sentence. You saw too much. He moved cities, changed his number, deleted all his social accounts. But the fear traveled with him like an ink stain that wouldn't wash out. David's doctor prescribed pills. His editor offered silence. Eventually, he was quietly fired under the pretense of budget restructuring. But David wasn't broken. He was boiling beneath the surface, like a kettle left too long on the burner. That's when he started writing again. Not for publication. For himself. A manuscript tentatively titled The Passenger Nobody Sees. A fictional account that was anything but fiction. Every page was a puzzle, coded, encrypted with his findings, his paranoia, and his guilt. When his last savings check cleared, David didn't tell anyone where he was going. He purchased a burner phone, scribbled down 2 coordinates from an old travel guide, and bought a one-way ticket to Romania with a single duffel bag and the thumb drive containing his unfinished manuscript sewn into the lining of his coat. He told himself the goal was simple: get off the grid, finish the book, and disappear on his own terms before someone else made that decision for him. But beneath that logic simmered another layer, one he couldn't quite admit out loud. He wanted to find something. Maybe it was proof that he wasn't insane. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe it was punishment. After all, the last source he quoted in that fateful article had vanished 2 weeks later. Her name was Esther Radic, a cybersecurity specialist with connections to Eastern Bloc intelligence archives. Before she disappeared, she had warned David cryptically, "They don't erase the past. They preserve it where no one dares to look." The name stuck with him. Radic. R. The initials on the scarf in the compartment. Coincidence, maybe, but for a man like David, coincidences were relics of a former life. Now everything meant something. He remembered how Esther had spoken of ghost trains in her final interview. Decommissioned carriages used by the state decades ago. Repurposed not to carry people, but to erase them. Moving prisons that never stopped, never arrived, just circled the darkness between nations that denied their existence. At the time, David had dismissed it as paranoia. But sitting in compartment 9, staring at the blue bulb and the burlap sack, her words surged back like floodwater breaching a dam. He reached into his coat and brushed his fingers against the lining, feeling for the thumb drive as if it might anchor him in reality. Outside the window, the landscape blurred into an unbroken sheet of black, not darkness but absence. An abyss so complete it almost looked artificial, as if the world outside had been painted over. Inside, the cold grew sharper, the kind that seemed to come from within the walls. David pulled the scarf from the bag and wrapped it around his neck, even though it smelled faintly of mothballs and something more chemical. The initials brushed against his collarbone like a signature written in warning. He recalled that Esther's last known location had been in this region, somewhere along this very line. She had sent him a package before she vanished. Coordinates scribbled on a napkin and a flash drive that refused to be decrypted, even by the most advanced software he had access to. He had brought it with him, too, tucked between the pages of his notebook. The journal, worn leather and duct-taped along the spine, was his confessional, the only place left where his thoughts were safe. Page after page of half-written code, conspiracy maps, names crossed out violently with red ink, and sketches of symbols he didn't remember drawing. At the center of the journal was a crude drawing of a train, a single carriage surrounded by ink-black fog, labeled only with a number, 9. The image was circled 3 times. David didn't remember when he had drawn it. He didn't remember drawing it at all. But there it was. A warning? Prophecy? Or something worse? He flipped the journal shut and stared at the compartment door, now closed again, though he hadn't touched it. Had it ever truly been open? The blue light flickered once more, and this time, a faint click came from beneath the bed, like a latch unlocking or relocking. David stood slowly, knees cracking, heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He got on this train to escape, to vanish quietly, but he was beginning to understand that some trains didn't carry you away from danger, they delivered you to it. And maybe, just maybe, that was why he had boarded in the first place. The train had been rumbling through blackness for what felt like hours, the landscape outside no more than a smear of nothingness that swallowed every shape, every tree, every sign of life. Inside compartment 9, David sat with his back to the cold metal wall, his fingers locked together, eyes glued to the blue bulb flickering above him. It was the only light source in the room, and even it seemed tired, as if pulsing from a heart ready to give out. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was weaponized. Not a single other footstep had echoed in the corridor, not a cough, not a creak from the other rooms. The train may as well have been moving through space. Then came the sudden jolt. The brakes screeched. The entire carriage groaned, shaking just enough to rattle the metal coat hook above the door. David instinctively grabbed the side of the bed to steady himself, but what shook him more wasn't the movement. It was that it stopped. Completely. Not like a scheduled pause. Like something was wrong. He got up and approached the window, squinting into the darkness. Thick fog pressed against the glass from the outside. A dense wall of pale mist so suffocating it looked solid. No station lights. No platform. Just a swirl of white devouring black. Then a sound, gravel crunching. Outside? No, closer. Beneath him. He pressed his ear to the wall and heard wheels. The soft rotation of metal trolleys moving through the narrow corridor. Not quickly. Not like luggage. He stepped back from the door, breath shallow, as the hallway fell quiet again. Then, a shadow slipped past the bottom crack of the door, blocking the faint light from the corridor. The knob turned slowly. The door creaked open, and in walked the conductor, expressionless, dragging a large medical gurney behind him. The gurney carried a body, pale, still, covered only partially by a stained white sheet that did little to disguise the outline of a face. The eyes were closed, mouth slightly parted. One arm dangling limply over the side as the wheels clattered into the room. David froze. "What is this?" he asked, voice shaking. The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he wheeled the gurney against the opposite wall and silently pulled the door shut behind him. He reached into his coat, withdrew a long iron key, inserted it into the outer lock, and with a loud clunk, sealed the door. No eye contact, no words, just the silence of a verdict being handed down. Then he walked away and David was left alone with the corpse. The quiet was unbearable. David stared at the body, unsure whether to approach or pretend it wasn't there. But it was impossible to ignore. The sheet didn't cover the whole face, just enough to obscure identity, as though it were half inviting recognition. David's breath came faster. Was this a mistake? A medical transport gone wrong? But then why lock him in with it? He approached slowly, every step echoing in the confined space. The man on the gurney was middle-aged, face waxy, with a stitched scar running from his collarbone to just under the jawline. The skin around it was tinged purple, old blood dried in the creases of his neck. His fingernails were clean, too clean. David examined the other hand and found something odd. A tight curl of paper shoved beneath the thumbnail. He hesitated, then pried it out gently, unfolding it to reveal a small note written in block Cyrillic letters. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. He didn't understand the language, but the last line was in English. "We never die on this train." David's mouth went dry. He turned the note over, nothing else. Just that single, haunting sentence. He stumbled back, sat on the edge of his cot, and stared at the body. He told himself not to panic. There had to be a reason, a bureaucratic mix-up, an emergency reroute. But those were lies, soft blankets thrown over razors. This was deliberate. He looked up at the blue light, which now buzzed more aggressively, as if reacting to his thoughts. The reflection in the mirror showed both him and the body, side by side. 2 passengers. One alive. One? The body moved, or at least something about it changed. He couldn't tell what at first, just a shift in presence. Like someone changing posture ever so slightly when they think no one's watching. David bolted upright, heart thudding. The body hadn't twitched. It hadn't gasped. But it was undeniably different. He approached again, slower this time, examining the face. Still eyes, still mouth. But the left foot, which had been dangling over the edge, was now slightly raised, the toes just brushing the gurney's edge. He reached out and touched the skin, cold, but not stiff. He felt for a pulse out of instinct, even though every rational part of him screamed not to. Nothing. No heartbeat. But no rigor mortis either. A sudden pounding echoed from the other side of the compartment door. 3 knocks. Just like before. David ran to the door and shouted, "What's going on? Open this damn door." But no reply came. Only silence. Then, just as quickly, another knock. Softer this time, more like a whisper than a demand. He pressed his face against the crack, trying to catch a glimpse, but the corridor was empty. The only sound now was the faint creaking of the gurney's wheels shifting slightly, except David hadn't touched it. He turned around, and the body was no longer where it had been. The gurney had moved a few inches toward the mirror. That was impossible. The floor was perfectly level. No incline, no momentum. He rushed to the window, desperate to see where they were, but the fog had thickened. It was now pressed up against the glass like a living thing. Shapes twisted inside it. Arms? No. Shadows. But they moved with intention. David backed away, sat on the bed again, and clenched his fists. This was psychological warfare. It had to be. Some kind of breakdown. But then he noticed something that shattered even that desperate explanation. The corpse was wearing a silver pendant. The exact same one he'd found in the burlap sack. Still engraved with the date. October 12, 1974. David's mind reeled. The same object on 2 bodies? Or one? He reached for his bag, unzipped the inner lining, and pulled out the pendant. Identical, down to the scratch across the lower corner. But how? Suddenly, a deep hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, low and guttural, like a machine being awakened after decades of slumber. The light above flickered violently, then steadied. The gurney slid another inch. David grabbed the key from his coat pocket, trying it on the inside latch. It didn't fit. He banged against the door with both fists, screaming this time, desperate, panicked, rage rising in his throat like bile. But nothing. No conductor. No movement outside. Just the reflection in the mirror, now showing the body's eyes open. David sat paralyzed in the cold, artificial glow of the flickering light. The reflection of the corpse's open eyes burned into his mind like a branding iron. He refused to turn around again, convinced that facing the body directly would change something fundamental in the room, maybe in himself. The walls seemed to lean inward now, as though the train were breathing, contracting with the slow rhythm of a beast preparing to lunge. He pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to rationalize, to grasp at logic. Maybe the eyes had been open all along and he'd only imagined them closed. Maybe he had fallen asleep and dreamt it. But that hope shattered the moment he looked into the mirror again and saw the corpse now sitting upright on the gurney. There was no transition, no sound. 1 second prone, the next fully seated, back straight, head tilted slightly downward like someone listening closely. David turned his head inch by inch, neck stiff as concrete, and finally faced it. The man on the gurney didn't move. His eyes were still open, unfocused, the pupils wide and glassy, yet his posture screamed of awareness. A breath escaped David's lips in a ragged whisper. He backed away, careful not to make sudden movements, as if the body might lurch at any provocation. He grabbed the journal from the edge of the bed and flipped through it, searching for something, anything, that made sense. And there it was again, the sketch of the train, compartment 9, a seated figure opposite a man who looked exactly like David. The gurney creaked as if affirming his fear, and David dropped the book. It landed open on a page he didn't remember writing. A crude diagram of a human chest with something drawn inside. A symbol, circular and jagged, wrapped in ink arrows pointing inward. It reminded him of something ancient, occult, a sigil etched into skin like a lock. The corpse's chest had been stitched shut. His gaze returned to the man, who remained still but had clearly not been in that position before. He was being observed, not hunted, not haunted, studied. And for the first time, David began to suspect he wasn't the one investigating the truth anymore. He was the subject. Shaking, he stepped toward the body, heart pounding so loud it made his ears ring. He leaned in and examined the stitches. Thick, black thread crisscrossed the sternum like a trapdoor sealed in haste. The lines weren't medically precise, they were ritualistic, almost hand-done in panic. Against his better judgment, David reached out and traced the edge of the thread, and beneath it, something twitched. Not muscle, not decay, movement, alive. He reeled back, crashing into the wall, knocking over the small tin shelf above the cot. Metal clanged against metal as the room seemed to tremble. Then, out of the silence, came a voice. It didn't come from the body. It didn't come from outside the compartment. It came from the intercom, the ancient, cracked speaker above the door that had previously only sputtered static. The voice spoke in a thick Eastern European accent, the cadence oddly formal, like a recital. If you are hearing this message, you have entered the transitional chamber. Do not attempt to leave. Observation is temporary. Compliance ensures continuity. The speaker cut off. David stood frozen, stunned by the cold bureaucratic tone of it all. Transitional chamber? Continuity? None of it made sense. But it was enough to shake him into action. He lunged at the door, banging on it with both fists, screaming until his throat turned raw. No one came. Not even a footstep down the corridor. Only the hum of machinery, subtle and distant, like gears turning in an unseen part of the train. He dropped to his knees, breathing heavily, and then noticed something new. Blood. A single drop on the floor, deep red, fresh. He followed it with his eyes to the gurney, where a slow trickle was leaking from the stitched chest. David stared in horror. Something inside the corpse was alive, or trying to escape. Panic sharpened into a violent edge, and he grabbed his penknife from his bag. It was meant for opening packages or slicing apples, small, harmless. But tonight it became a scalpel. He stepped forward, sweat pouring from his brow, and placed the blade against the edge of the stitched chest. The body didn't react. He took a breath and cut. One line, then another. The stitches gave way like dried glue. As he peeled them back, the skin opened slightly, and he saw metal. Not a heart. Not muscle. Wires. Tubes. A strange brass panel, like a miniature vault door embedded beneath the sternum. Etched into its surface was the same sigil from his journal. His breath caught in his throat. It was no longer about death or life, it was about design. This thing, whatever it was, had been made. Or modified. And someone wanted him to see it. He reached out to touch the panel and it glowed faintly beneath his fingers, warming like it responded to his presence. Before he could react, the corpse's hand twitched and latched onto his wrist. Not violently, gently, purposefully. David screamed and yanked back, falling over the chair beside him. The corpse fell backward too, the grip lost, but now its eyes blinked. Slowly, once, twice, the intercom crackled to life again. Secondary subject awake. Initial containment breached. Final sequence initiated. The voice was the same, but colder now, robotic, stripped of humanity. David backed against the wall, eyes darting to the window, then to the door. Now, outside in the corridor, he saw movement. A silhouette of someone or something, walking past slowly, pausing at each compartment door. The sound of locks clicking open echoed down the hallway one by one, like dominoes falling. David rushed to the door and tried the handle again. Still locked. From behind, the corpse spoke. The voice was wrong, hollow, metallic, but the words were unmistakable. You shouldn't have opened it. David turned to see the body, now sitting upright again, blood soaking through its shirt, yet smiling faintly. Now you'll hear them too. The gurney rolled backward on its own into the corner as if repositioning for a better view. Then came the whispering. At first faint, like static, but growing clearer. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in languages David didn't understand but instinctively feared. His head pounded. The light burst above him, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint glow from the corpse's chest. David dropped to the floor, covering his ears, shaking uncontrollably. He understood now this was never about transit, it was about transformation. The train wasn't taking him somewhere. It was changing him into someone who couldn't leave. Into something the next occupant of compartment 9 would be locked in with. David could no longer tell if it was night or day, nor did he remember when he last blinked without feeling like something inside the train blinked with him. The corpse had grown quiet again, lying prone on the gurney like nothing had happened, like its eyes hadn't opened, like its mouth hadn't whispered unspeakable things into the stale, recycled air. The intercom remained dead. The blue light was gone, replaced by a dim red hue that now pulsed from strips in the corners of the room, casting everything in a dull hellglow. David sat hunched against the door, bruised, exhausted, and half-mad. His journal clutched to his chest as his only tether to reality. The last page was now filled with symbols he didn't remember drawing, and beneath them, in handwriting that wasn't his, was a sentence that made his stomach curdle. We open from within. Suddenly, a loud mechanical clank rang through the floor, followed by a hiss of hydraulics releasing somewhere deeper in the train. For the first time since this nightmare began, the door handle clicked. David stood with a mix of dread and hope, slowly pulling the door open to find not the conductor, but a hallway bathed in the same red light, stretching in both directions with impossible depth. The corridor was no longer the one he remembered. The wood-paneled walls had been replaced with brushed steel, curved slightly inward, and the air smelled of copper and ozone. He stepped out, leaving the corpse behind, each footfall on the cold metal grates echoing like he was inside a vast chamber, not a train. Other compartment doors now stood open, every few feet, each one identical. He peered into the nearest and found another gurney. Another body. Different face, same pendant, same stitched chest. He checked the next compartment. Same again. And again. Each one perfectly staged. None of the corpses had decay, just pristine stillness. David walked faster now, his breath short, his mind spiraling. It wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about him. He had been selected, inserted into a script playing out over and over again. A passenger with just enough truth inside him to be deemed worthy, whatever that meant. The corridor sloped slightly upward as he moved, the incline so subtle it took him several minutes to realize he was no longer on a single level but climbing. Then the doors stopped. The hallway ended at a large circular hatch, pulsing softly with red light around its rim. No handle, no keypad, just a mirror set into its center. David stared into it and saw not his own reflection, but his compartment. Compartment 9. The gurney. The corpse. Only now it was him lying there, eyes closed, chest stitched. Behind the glass, the real image stared back, watching him watch himself. He stumbled backward, struck by the realization. He wasn't leaving. No one left. The train didn't go anywhere, it absorbed. He spun around, suddenly noticing movement in the shadows behind him. A shape darted into one of the side compartments. Then another. Multiple. Too fast to track. David grabbed the pendant around his neck, the one he thought he had left with the body. It was there again. Always there. He tore it off and threw it down the hall, but before it hit the ground it was gone. Vanished. He looked down at his chest, and the pendant was back, like it had grown from his skin. The hatch in front of him hissed, releasing a burst of cold air as it slowly slid open. Beyond it lay a staircase descending into a deeper darkness, one not lit by red or blue but filled with the absence of light, thick and suffocating. A whisper came from below. Not words. Shapes made of sound, sliding through his mind like ink through water. He backed away, but his foot hit something soft. He turned. The conductor stood behind him, silent as ever. But this time his face was different. Translucent, expressionless, the skin barely containing whatever machine ticked beneath. He raised a hand and pointed to the open hatch. David tried to speak, but no words came. The conductor stepped forward, hands still raised, until he was close enough to touch. Instead, he gently placed a new item into David's hand, a train manifest. David flipped it open. There were hundreds of names, listed over decades, all of them marked with 2 columns, entered and remained. No one had a mark under departed. At the very bottom, his name had already been typed. Next to it, under entered, was today's date. Remained was blank. For now. David looked up again, but the conductor was gone. Just like before. He was alone and yet entirely watched. Something in the air shifted. The lights turned white, blinding. For the first time, he could see the true scale of the space around him. This wasn't a single train car. It was a vessel, a segmented biomechanical organism that had once resembled a train only to lure the human mind into submission. And he had walked willingly into it. Every surface throbbed slightly, like a heartbeat. The corpses weren't passengers, they were stages of conversion. David bolted back down the corridor, past the doors, ignoring the shapes watching him. He had to get off. There had to be a way. He reached the rear of the train, where the door to the last car lay slightly ajar. He pushed through, heart in his throat, only to find a room completely different than the others. A control center. Screens lined the walls, each showing footage from different compartments, different trains, different people. Dozens of Davids, each locked in a compartment, interacting with a body, cutting the chest, finding the pendant. A loop, a lab, a trap. One screen showed him standing exactly where he was, watching the monitors. He reached out and touched it, and all the screens went black. Then came the voice again. Not from the intercom. Not from outside. From inside his head. You are ready. The door behind him locked. The walls began to change, shifting with a wet sound like muscle folding over itself. The control center vanished into smooth walls. He turned and saw a reflection in the now mirrored door, not of himself, but of the conductor, wearing his face, smiling faintly. It was never about survival. It was about succession, about finding the next vessel. And now the train had made its choice. The station was unmarked, unnamed, and unlit. No platform numbers, no signage, no announcements. Just a slab of cracked concrete surrounded by dense woods and a morning fog so thick it looked like the sky had fallen to the ground. As the train screeched to a stop, a solitary figure stepped off. No one greeted him. No one questioned his arrival. The moment his boots touched the earth, the train hissed and silently rolled backward, disappearing into the tree line as if it had never existed. The man watched it vanish without turning his head. He carried no bag, no journal, no expression, just the clothes on his back and the silver pendant that now rested against his chest like a final, irreversible signature. His name wasn't David anymore. Or maybe it was, depending on who asked. But no one would. The small border town of Vissner hadn't seen a train in over 30 years. At least not officially. The local papers never printed its schedule. The tracks were half swallowed by weeds and earth, like a scar the land was trying to forget. But every few years someone emerged from the forest. Always alone. Always silent. This one walked into the town square at dawn. His presence immediately felt, though no one could quite say why. He checked into a small guest house using a name that didn't exist in any database. The innkeeper handed him the key with trembling fingers, as though something primal deep inside her recognized what he was, but didn't want to see it clearly. That night, he sat by the window of his room, staring at the mountains. In the dim lamplight, he opened a new journal. Its pages were blank. The pen in his hand hovered for a moment before words began to flow, not as memories but as instructions. Symbols, diagrams, map coordinates, names in languages long considered extinct. On the front page, he wrote one sentence, "Only the train remembers." Then he closed the book and slept with his eyes open. Hundreds of miles away, in a government facility buried beneath a city whose name had been redacted from every satellite map, a low-level analyst flagged a strange anomaly. A live security feed briefly flickered on a decommissioned monitor showing a man in a sleeper car. A man who matched the biometric signature of David Rourke. But Rourke was declared dead 8 months ago, his body never found after his apartment exploded under mysterious circumstances. The analyst pulled the file, hesitated, then forwarded it to a supervisor who didn't exist. The feed vanished from the system 2 minutes later. The analyst never spoke of it again. In a forest near the border, hunters reported hearing the sound of a train passing through the trees. No tracks, no station, just a low, ghostly rumble that sent animals scattering and left the air sharp with the smell of ozone and burnt copper. One swore he saw flickering lights among the trees. Another said he heard knocking, slow, deliberate, like someone trying to be let out. Weeks later, the conductor returned to the original station, the one David had boarded from. But it wasn't David who accompanied him now. It was another man, pale, silent, wearing clothes that didn't match the season. He held a bag in one hand and a pendant in the other. The conductor placed him into compartment 9, nodded once, and sealed the door. The ritual resumed. The loop closed. Somewhere far away, another journal flipped itself open to a page David had never written but somehow knew. If you're reading this, you were never meant to arrive. Back in Vissner, the man once called David spent his days walking the outskirts of town, sketching the shape of the train into the dirt with his boot. Locals whispered about him, never rudely, always carefully. He spoke to no one, but children swore he sometimes stared at them with eyes that didn't blink. Then, one day, he was gone. The guesthouse room was untouched. The journal gone. The only thing left behind was a metal pendant on the pillow, the initials ER etched beside a date no one could decipher. At the next equinox, a new man appeared at the border. He was frightened, disoriented, mumbling about being locked in with a corpse. He carried a journal filled with unfamiliar handwriting and had no recollection of how he got there. When questioned by the local authorities, he claimed to be a journalist. But no such person had ever worked in the region. His fingerprints matched no known citizen. Eventually, he vanished from the holding cell without explanation. The door remained locked. There was no investigation. There was no follow-up. There was no record of the train. Because the train only appears to those who have seen too much, who have touched truths no one was meant to survive. It doesn't kill them. That would be merciful. Instead, it repurposes them, rewrites them, sends them back into the world carrying knowledge like a virus. Quiet, undetected, patient. The corpse in compartment 9 is never the same man twice, but the process always begins the same way. Silence, flickering lights, and a conductor who never speaks. And somewhere, in a place that doesn't exist on any map, a rail car sits in motionless fog, sealed from the inside. This occupant is not yet dead, but soon someone else will arrive. Someone curious, someone brave, someone foolish enough to believe that boarding a train in Eastern Europe would be the end of their journey instead of the beginning. And when they do, the door will close, the blue light will flicker, and the train will once again begin to move. Only one ever gets off. And even then, they don't return as themselves.